So we're wrapping up. I'm a little sad, actually, honestly, that we're wrapping up a series today called Making Room. I don't know about you all, and I don't want to know. I've really enjoyed putting these together. I've really gotten a lot out of putting these together. I hope that they have been helpful for you all in one way or another. But just to recap, in case you missed out or weren't paying attention, we've been, over the last 5 or 6 weeks, talking about hospitality, what Christian hospitality looks like, what it looks like to make room. So at the very beginning in week 1, we talked about kind of hospitality generally as a practice, that it's at the center of practicing the gospel, that it's not an option, that it's a crucial part of kingdom life. If we want to say that Christ comes to see us, comes to meet us in the midst of our sin, in the midst of our hurt and trouble, and that he invites us in, that part of living out the gospel is doing that same thing to the others around us, inviting them in, and that hospitality is about showing up and showing love. It's not about showing off. In week 2, we talked about part of the practice of hospitality is learning to share. There were goldfish all over the stage, if you recall. That God blesses our generosity, and the key to generosity is remembering that none of it belongs to us anyways. You know, it's always easier to share something that belongs to someone else, and good news, none of your stuff is really yours, so share away. In the 3rd week, we talked about actually making physical room for people. When we talk about making room, what's it look like to actually invite people into our space? I keep thinking about the video that we showed when the kids were up here, and one of the questions was, what does it mean to open your home? And one of our younger ones said, just open the door. And so we said that week that that's what part of what making room is. Just open the door. And don't worry about it being presentable. Just worry about being present. And then last week, very grateful I am, Jim stepped in and talked about making room for interruptions. And he said his one point, Jesus makes room for people. Jesus has time for people, makes time for people. And I have to tell you, after last week's making room for interruptions debacle, for those of you, not because Jim's sermon was bad, it was very good, that we decided we were going to talk about making room for interruptions, and that whole week, like, everything fell apart and we were all getting pulled in kind of weird directions. There were many, many interruptions that week, and I should know better, but instead we leaned in. We're living dangerously, because today we're wrapping up this series by talking about making room for heartache. I know, what am I thinking? It was such... Well, here we are. We're gonna power through. I hope that we're able to find some things in the story. We'll be in John 11. I hope we're able to find some things in the story that are helpful for us as we kind of wrap up thinking about making room. Hard left turn. Not a fan of reality television shows. Do any of you watch reality TV? I'm not going to judge you too harshly. No, I got a couple no's. I got a couple yeses. You know, my wife and I differ very much. Jim's over here nodding yes. My wife and I differ very much in our approach to reality TV shows. She likes a lot of, I'll watch, like, I'll be in the same room while she's watching and won't run away. That's what I say. I'm not really watching. She's watching, and I'm just there. I'm not invested or anything. But she likes to say, you know, with all the craziness and all the drama and all these shows, she says it's sometimes a helpful reminder to her when her life feels crazy, when her family seems crazy. She's like, I like to watch these shows because it reminds me it could always be worse. Like... You know what I mean? It's like, at least we're not that. I, on the other hand, it makes me, anxious. Like, just hearing all the drama in those, just listening to it. I'm like, no, I don't want that kind of drama and tension in my life. I have enough of my own. I don't need to introduce more from the outside. And nothing against anybody who watches reality TV. I wonder, though, if my approach to reality TV, I generally avoid it because I don't want the drama. Like, I don't need the extra drama and the extra tension in my world, in my life, in my house. I wonder sometimes if that same attitude gets in the way of us practicing hospitality and making room for people in our lives, because we know deep down, making room for people means making room for messes. Because people, as it turns out, real messy. And sometimes it's easier, instead of just opening the door or sharing or whatever, to say, you know what, I don't have room. I don't have room for the drama. I don't have room for the hurt and the heartache. The problem with that is, if we're not making room for those things, I'm not sure we're really practicing the gospel. This is, if I have one point, like Jim had one point last time, if I have one point, it's this, that practicing Christian hospitality means we have to make room for other people's hurt, other people's heartache. We can't just leave those things on the outside. We can't settle for superficial fellowship where we just say hi-bye, we pass in the hallway or in the foyer coming and going from here, and ignore all those things, all the realities of people's lives and people's hurt. Because central to practicing hospitality is making room for all of that stuff. It's kind of the point. It's not about the meals and all of those things. The meals are a tool to get us to this point, to get us to the point that we're really sharing our lives with people. So that's what we want to look at today. We're going to take a look at a story that's probably familiar to a lot of us from John 11. It's the story of Lazarus and Jesus' interaction with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Just to kind of put it in context, the gospel as a whole, in John 11 we have this story. John 12 is when Jesus kind of arrives in Jerusalem for the last time. He is arrested he goes in the upper room with his disciples in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. He does a lot of talking. We're in the part before that. Just as an aside, it has nothing to do with anything, but I'm overly caffeinated. It's very funny to me, very preacherly, actually, it seems to me, that Jesus is talking to his disciples in chapter 14. At the end of John 14, you'll see he says, okay, that's enough. Arise, let's go. And then he talks to them for 3 more chapters. It's like that old in conclusion, and then preach for 20 more minutes type of vibe. But anyways, we have Jesus in chapter 11. We have John telling the story of his second trip to the home of Mary and Martha. We heard about Mary and Martha a few weeks ago, that Jesus came to their house, and Martha was very busy with the preparations, and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet. So these are the same folks. We'll pick up this story in John 11, starting in verse 1. It says this, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. This happens in chapter 12 in John, but carry on. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one who you love is sick. This is what happens. This is what I'm afraid of, making room for people in my life, in my home, in my calendar. The masks come off eventually. As you keep making room for people, as you continue to practice hospitality, relationships deepen, and then we end up sharing our hurts with one another, our heartaches. We really share our lives. This is what I'm trying to avoid in general, right? This is kind of our take sometimes on hospitality. I don't need all that stuff. I want to go to Mary and Martha's, have a nice dinner that Martha prepares, have a nice chat with Mary. I don't need this, now we have problems, now we have troubles, we have needs. But here we are. And this is maybe one of the things that we need to keep in mind as we try to practice this hospitality, as we try to practice Christian hospitality, is this, that if we aren't sharing these things, if we aren't sharing our needs and our heartaches and our hurts, then we really aren't experiencing Christian fellowship at its fullest. Like I said at the beginning of this series, I think we've done ourselves a disservice if we think Christian fellowship is just what we do in this room in the morning, once a week, for 40 minutes or 50, however long I talk. That if that's all we're doing, we're really missing out when the Word calls us to fellowship and to make relationships and make connections with each other. It has to be this stuff too. It has to be the deeper connections, the deeper relationships that include sharing our hurts with one another. Paul says this in Romans chapter 12. He says, share it with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. And a couple verses later, he says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. We share our joys and we share our hurts and our hardships, and we hurt with people as they are hurting. We can't just be in it for the good times. Lions fans understand this better than anyone. Sorry. Any sport in general, right? There's the people who just like, oh yeah, I'll watch, and the team that I like is winning, so this is good, and when they're not winning, I turn it off, because, just and walk away. it's very easy to stand by people when they're winning, and when they're losing, to just be like, yeah, I don't have time. I don't have time for this. I'm a big fan of the Olympics. Very big. I'm very excited that they've just started. I was thinking, as we were putting stuff like this together, of the last Summer Games and Simone Biles. Simone Biles, incredible gymnast, maybe the best, one of the best that's ever done it. She's just incredible. If you may remember, if you're an Olympics junkie like myself, if you're not, this might be news from 4 years ago, that in the last Summer Games, she stepped out. In the middle of the contest, she was having issues with her balance, and I think they call it twisties, is the technical term, the gymnast, that she was having a hard time with all the spinning and rotating, couldn't realize like when she's flipping which way down was, which is very dangerous. I mean, the girl could like jump over me and do flips and stuff, and if she doesn't know where down is, she could really hurt herself. And the number of people that got so furious about this, that would love to talk, oh, Simone Biles, oh, wow, she's great. Oh, look at the gold medals she got 8 years ago. And then when she decides, I'm not well. I could really hurt myself, and I need to step out. They weren't there for that. They weren't all about the hardship and hurt. They got all upset. This is sometimes what we do with our relationships. We're in it for the good stuff. And when people share their hurts or when people reveal their struggles, we're like, I don't have time for that. The problem is, that is against what Paul calls the law of Christ. So if you look at Galatians chapter 6, Paul says this: carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Now, there's two sides of it, I guess. On the one hand, we don't want to share our burdens. I don't want to share my struggles with people because I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to weigh them down. And on the other side of that, we don't make room for other people sometimes because we don't want to have to carry their struggles and their hurts. But the problem is, that's the world's way of doing it. The world says relationships are for my edification. I have relationships with people so that I can enjoy our time together. But when their hurt starts infringing on that, I should step away. That's not what the Word says. When people share their hurts and their heartaches, we lean in, we carry one another through those times, and in that way, we fulfill the law of Christ. That is precisely what Christ tells us to do. Not just to share our burdens with others, but to let others share their burdens with us so that we can help carry them. Mary and Martha do it. Our brother's sick. Come and help. So we pick up. John 11. In verse 4, we'll go through some of this fairly quickly. I just want us to look at a couple of things in this section. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." "Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After this he said, after he had said this, he went on to say, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep, so he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, this is the part I want us to focus on. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, so that we may die with him." There's a lot going on in this story. There's a lot going on in John as a whole of the disciples sort of understanding things, but not really fully understanding things, and Jesus continuing to call people, not just the disciples, but continuing to call people to a deeper knowledge, a deeper understanding of who he is. A lot of that going on in here that we're not going to look at today. But I want us to look at what Thomas says at the end there. Thomas said to the rest of them, "Let us also go, so that we may die with him." Thomas gets a bad rap most of the time, right? You know Thomas's other name? Doubting Thomas. This is what people, doubting Thomas. It's always that. It's always doubting Thomas. Didymus is that. That's two. Good, 8 point. Doubting Thomas. That's all we think of. You ask someone like, tell me one thing about Thomas. That's always the thing. Oh yeah, doubting Thomas. Unless I see the holes in his hands, put my hand in his side, I will not believe. Doubting Thomas. That's all he ever gets. But there's this story that confronted with something he doesn't really understand. And none of the disciples really get what's going on. John tells us that much. They don't understand that Lazarus is really dead. Jesus has to spell things out for them. But Thomas, even though he doesn't get it, insists on staying with Jesus. Jesus' beloved friend is dead. Lazarus is the one person that John consistently tells us Jesus loved. He's dead. Jesus has to travel to a dangerous location to see him. He says, we have to go back to this place. And they're like, the last time you were there, people tried to kill you. He says, we have to go. And even though none of the disciples really understand the full scope of the situation, Thomas insists that they all should stay with Jesus. He doesn't know what's going to happen. When he says, let us die with him, he could be thinking that they're all actually going to be executed because last time you were there, they tried to kill you. He could just mean the kind of emotional trauma of going to see your now dead friend. He says, let us go so that we can die with him. Thomas wants to be there. Whatever happens, whatever Jesus is walking into, Thomas wants to be there. And this is the second thing that I want us to remember from this story is sometimes the most powerful and, in fact, the most Christ-like thing that we can do is to be present with people when they are going through difficult times. Just to be there. Not to fix it, not to necessarily say everything right or do everything right, but just to be present with people when they are suffering. Jesus goes to be with Mary and Martha. Thomas insists on going with Jesus, just to be there. It makes me think of, the book of Job has lots of suffering in it, if you're not familiar. It also has a lot of people talking and trying to fix things and making them immeasurably worse. But early on in that story, the first couple chapters, when the story is kind of being laid out, we hear all the bad things that are happening to Job. We meet Job's friends for the first time, and I really love what it says about it. So the end of Job chapter 2, starting in verse 11, it says, when Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, well, there's that, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him. They set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes, sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Job's friends showed up. In the next chapter, they open their mouths and ruin everything. But still, they showed up to be present with him in the midst of his suffering. I always think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you may have heard the name. He's a pastor from Germany, was killed in the early 1940s. But he was a vocal opponent, besides being a pastor, a vocal opponent of Adolf Hitler in his rise to power. He found out that he was on a list to be executed, and so he escaped from Germany. Escaped from Germany to New York. He lived in the Bronx, I think, or Brooklyn, one or the other, for a little while. But then, and you can read this in his letters, which have been published after his death, he decided, and in his words, I made a mistake by escaping to America. He said, because how could I be a part of the rebuilding of my nation after all of this tragedy if I am not present with my people during their suffering? And he went back. And it's an amazing, if not tragic, story that he chose because of what he believed about Christ, because of what he believed about the importance of being present and the importance of being Jesus' hands and feet to those who are suffering. He went back because he understood that the most Christ-like thing we can do sometimes is to be with people when they suffer. Jesus gets it. Thomas gets it. Job's friends get it until they don't. And the story carries on. So we're not going to read the whole rest of the story, just pieces, parts. But Martha runs out. Martha, remember, who's the one busy in the kitchen making all the preparations, not paying attention to Jesus. Martha has learned since then. And Martha runs out to Jesus and meets him on the road. And she says in that verse, verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Keep this in mind. If you'd been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus talks to Martha for a little bit about resurrection, and she says, yes, I know my brother will be raised in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says, I'm the resurrection. And they go back and forth, this whole kind of unpacking of who Jesus truly is. And then Martha runs back and gets her sister. And Mary is brought out. And Mary, in verse 32, confronts Jesus. Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him. She fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, period, full stop, end of sentence. There's very different responses sometimes to hardship and suffering and hurt. Martha runs out to meet Jesus, and even in her confusion and her hurt, recognizes that Jesus is powerful to do something. There's an element of hope to Martha's response to this whole thing. I know that God will do anything you ask. She runs expectantly to Jesus. On the other hand, Mary, the one who had been sitting at Jesus' feet weeks, months, who knows, earlier, all she's got is the frustration. All she's got is the angst. If you had been here, but you weren't. My brother wouldn't have died, but he did. And there's a lot of things that we could unpack from that. My first job, it's a very strange thing, I suppose. My first job in high school, I was 15 or 16, I was at a funeral home. You know, that normal job for kids to have. And I tell people, in the couple years that I worked there, I probably went to hundreds of funerals as a teenager. Most of them not people I knew, but hundreds. And I learned many things there, but one of the things I learned there is that everybody approaches hardship differently. Everybody mourns differently. Everyone suffers differently. And sometimes I would see people respond like Martha. You know, God, I don't get it. I'm frustrated. If you had been here, if you'd been doing something, this wouldn't have turned out this way. But I understand that you can do anything you want. I understand that you are powerful to redeem this situation. Sometimes people respond to suffering and hardship with hope and faith and trust. And sometimes people were just mad. They're just frustrated and upset. And if you've ever experienced that, or maybe you are experiencing that, the hope I can give you is that God can handle us being upset with him. Lots of people have been upset with God before. And the way Jesus responds to Mary, I think, is very helpful for me. Martha runs out. She says, I don't understand, but I trust. I have hope. And Jesus draws her in and pulls her to a deeper understanding of who he is. Mary runs out with just the frustration, just the angst and the baggage. And Jesus scolds her and tells her, you're a terrible person, you should just believe. No, he does not do that. He doesn't. In verse 33, we carry on. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. It's my favorite part about John is all those come and sees. Verse 35, Jesus wept, and then the Jews said, see how he loved him. He doesn't scold Mary. He doesn't get after her for not believing. He doesn't say, why couldn't you be more like your sister? He's present, and that's all. He goes to her brother's graveside with her, and he weeps. That's it. He saw his friends hurting. He saw the people around them hurting. He was moved by all of that, and he just wept with them, hurt with them. And that's the dangerous part about making room. We make room for others in the midst of their heartache because Christ gave us this example. He made room for us. If you make room for people's hurting, it's going to hurt. I'm sorry, that's just the truth of it. But we have to do it anyways. We do it because Jesus did it. We do it because Jesus did it for us. And by doing it for others, by showing up for others in the midst of their hurt and hurting with them, we can be Jesus for them in those moments, in those times. And that's the point of it all. All of the other stuff, making room for visitors, making room for generosity, making room for interruptions, all of those things is really ultimately for this, to get to this point. Because the first step is people being comfortable coming in the door. And then they're comfortable sitting at the table. And then they're comfortable lingering for a while. And then they're comfortable coming over before you invite them because they just need to be with someone, because they're going through it. That's what all of this is for. This is the last week of our series, but I don't think that means we're done making room. It's been maybe one of my favorite parts of this whole thing is that I've heard people talk to me, that people have talked not about, just the kind of typical, hey, nice sermon. I'm like, yeah. But that, we did this. People saying, hey, I did this, or we got the opportunity to do this, and it was amazing. It was great. We got to make room. Maybe it was for an extra person at a dinner table. Maybe it was making time for a phone call or whatever. But several people have talked about to me over the last few weeks, experiencing this and seeing what God does with that. And that's amazing, and I want us to keep doing that. And my prayer is that this practice would continue to grow in our lives, in our church, in our community, so that people might see Christ in us. They might come to know Christ through us as we show them what the gospel looks like in action. It looks like making room.